The Hulu original series, Furious, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
There are 3 victims we know of. The suspect is female, white, late 20s.
Female serial killers
Kill for power, control. I believe there's a deeper motivation here.
You have no idea who you're dealing with, and you are going to end up dead.
I've been waiting for you.
Watch the Hulu original series, Furious, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+. For bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
This episode is supported by FX's The Shards, a seductive drama from executive producer Ryan Murphy. Set in 1980s Los Angeles, the series follows a group of glamorous, deeply entangled high school seniors drawn into a life of wealth, beauty, parties, and excess. At its center is Brett, whose reality begins to unravel when the arrival of a new student coincides with a series of mysterious murders. FX's The Shards premieres August 5th on FX and Hulu.
Говорит Москва.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the phone.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies, Debrief. You might think you know the story of the Cambridge Five, but writer Antonia Senior wants you to think again. Her new book, Stalin's Apostles, tells the de-glamorized tale of the world-famous spies Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. And it spells out the horrific consequences of their work for countless lives in Central and Eastern Europe. This week, Antonia sits down with True Spies producer Morgan Childs to talk about what she calls her Stalin-centric new book, and about how it finally corrects the historical record.
Antonia, I have to admit that when I first learned about your book, I thought, well, I know the Cambridge Five, I know this story. Of course, it turned out not to be quite the case. But I'd like to start by asking about what you knew about this, so-called ring of spies before you got to work on this, and whether if that's any different than the way much of the public understands them.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had read lots about them, obviously, which was why I was interested in them. And what I felt I knew about them was quite a lot about their private lives, quite a lot about their sex lives even. And I felt like I'd read a number of books and I'd come away not quite understanding what difference they'd made to anything, what the impact of their treachery had been. And I sort of wanted to read a book that told the story of like how their betrayals fitted into the wider story of Stalin's foreign policy. And I couldn't really find that book, which is why I basically ended up deciding to write that book, because I felt there was a little bit of a gap. So, they're very strong figures in our kind of cultural memory, and everybody knows bits and pieces of the story. And what's happened in the last decade or more is that each of them has attracted individual kind of treatments, but it's been quite a long time since anybody kind of looked at all 5 of them, put them in the bigger picture, worked out exactly what they meant to the Soviets as well as their impact on the British establishment.
And I've heard you say that you had a political awakening a few years ago in regards to the far left, and that informed some of the ideas in the book. Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, so I was sort of busy doing other things. I was writing novels, raising children. I wasn't paying huge amounts of attention to kind of the wider cultural world. And what it was, there's a young journalist who's very articulate, very brilliant. And she went on television and she said, in response to a question where someone accused her of being a communist, she said, well, yes, I am literally a communist. And I sort of popped my head up and looked around me and realised that communism was having yet another one of its periodic resurgences. It's like the idea that never dies. It's like, the game Whack-A-Mole, like one communist experiment fails, millions of people die, and it disappears for a little while and then up it pops, sometimes with new iterations. So I was thinking quite a lot about what it was that's so persuasive about communism, how there is no moral equivalence with the other great 20th century totalitarian evil, which is Nazism. And, I don't think there necessarily should be exact moral equivalence, but there should at least be the conversation that the two are in the same room, right? And yet, imagine a young, ambitious journalist going on television and saying, yes, well, I am literally a Nazi. It's just unthinkable. I became slightly obsessed with the idea of left-wing politics and its grip on young minds, like not democratic left-wing politics, but like far left politics, and how it just never seems to let go, no matter how many times we are treated to example after example in real life of how destructive and horrible it is. And that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to writing this story. So yeah, this was another period in history in the 1930s where young people were so attracted to this idea and were willing to do extraordinarily horrible things in pursuit of its ideals.
And then part and parcel with this is the idea of class. I mean, you write early in the book that the Cambridge Five story has become a fable about class. Tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I think part of the way that we've told this story is that it doesn't matter in some senses because it's just a bunch of posh boys betraying other posh boys and being protected by yet more posh boys. And therefore, as a story, it's just a kind of morality play that posh boys are bad too, you know, that the establishment protects its own. There's like all kind of slightly reductive fables. There's an element of truth in it, but I felt what it was hiding was a more interesting and profound story about the wider implications of what they were doing and who it was actually hurting. Because for these five men, particularly for Donald Maclean, actually, I'm sure we'll talk about them individually later, but for these five men, their communism wasn't just about class, it was about internationalism. It was the idea of spreading the communist world revolution, kind of one utopia, one world, right? And the issue with this is that there are victims of this. There are people who don't want to be communists, right, in the places where they're exporting communism. So in our preoccupation with the kind of impact of the Five story on class politics in the UK, and obviously we're obsessed with class in Britain, what we're missing is a different story, which is that they were serving Stalin, whose project was essentially imperial in nature. It was pushing the boundaries of the Soviet world out and beyond the borders of Russia. And the victims, therefore, of their treachery, the people who were hurt by Stalin's project or laboured under Stalin's curse, as some historians have called it, they were not posh boys from Chelsea. These were the people of Eastern and Central Europe who were under Stalin's yoke, whether they wanted it or not, and treated to the joys of a communist utopia, whether or not they wanted it.
I'm curious to ask, I mean, certainly the British have a different understanding of social class than we Americans do, but do you see this sort of misreading of the story as a specifically British phenomenon?
Yeah, I think it's another way that we've turned this into a very British story and a very Anglo-centric story, because we've made it the only lens through which we view this story. And part of what I wanted to do was break out of that Anglo-centric, myopic kind of version of this tale and take it wider. You know, because apart from anything else, the moment where all these young men were recruited in Britain in the 1930s, it wasn't just happening in Britain. It was happening in America, in Australia. This was not just about the British caste system. There were plenty of young men in America who were not playing the same class rules, who were induced by this ideology to spy for Stalin. Okay, so it doesn't make sense to view the whole thing through this prism. It just cuts out other things, other elements. Which is not to say it's not interesting and it's important. I think the other way that it plays into the story in a kind of slightly problematic way is one of the consequences of the exposure of the Cambridge Five was to undermine this British establishment, this chapocracy, I call it in the book, this idea that, you know, everybody who's in the same class and is a decent chap can be trusted. So it blows that out of the water, which in one sense is obviously a positive thing and it's been seen as a really good thing. So in one sense, if you leave the victims of the Cambridge Five to one side, if you forget about what they were doing to serve Stalin, actually what you're left with is a picture which an awful lot of kind of British cultural memory is of the Cambridge Five. What you're left with is a picture of these guys who betrayed a class that's kind of worth betraying and then subsequently sort of smashed parts of an establishment that was worth smashing in the process of betraying a country that was worth betraying, right? I guess this is the other way that portrayal has become slightly invidious. It isn't that helpful. You know, class is obviously an important and integral part of the story. It's just, it's not the only story.
Getting into the story itself, I think that one of the most important characters to help explain some of this narrative surrounding the Cambridge Five is the one who set it all in motion. Can you tell us a little bit about Arnold Deutsch and the social phenomena that were taking place that allowed him to sort of get the ball rolling?
Arnold Deutsch is an incredible character. So he's an Austrian communist. He is from a school which has discovered Freud and Marx at a similar time. So they're kind of infusing their Marxism with psychoanalytical techniques, if you like. And he arrives in Britain in 1934. And what he finds is a country in which there is a genuine social contagion of young, well-to-do, upper middle class, if you like, young people who are completely enthralled by the tenets of communism. Now, in part, this is the usual kind of iconoclasm of the young, but in part, it is a genuine and reasonable reaction to the fact that we've just had the Great Depression. The shadow of the Great War is long and pervasive. And I think, to sort of circle a little bit back to this political awakening of mind, there was a moment in the 1930s where young people believed that they were being bequeathed a terrible world by their parents and there must be a better way of doing it. You can sort of appreciate their enthusiasm even if you disagree with their conclusions, right? So Arnold Deutsch arrives, he looks around, he has this idea, and it does seem to have come from Arnold Deutsch. He is what's called an illegal, which means he's working for Soviet intelligence, but he's not employed directly by them, and in the sense that he has diplomatic cover if anything goes wrong. He's in Britain, he's pretending to be a student at this stage, really. And he has this idea that if he can find the right young people who are wedded to this ideal before they've started work, they can fly under the radar and they can embed themselves into the British establishment and they can get day jobs and they can rise up through the establishment. And then at some point, they will be incredibly helpful to the Great Soviet project. So this is what he sets out to do. So he's going looking for young idealistic communists who have a shot as well at being part of the kind of British Empire establishment.
Talk to me about Deutsch as a psychologist. I mean, one detail that I find so fabulous is the fact that he had this read on Kim Philby that in some cases was quite accurate and in others that, for example, that he would be a bad liar. When
he ends up kind of recruiting them, he writes these extraordinary kind of psychological profiles of them, which he sends to Moscow. And on a lot of them, he's quite astute. He's also quite trapped by his analytical framework. So he wants them to be class rebels in a certain way because that fits his Marxist schematic. He's an adherent of a psychological school called the Adler School, which places a lot of emphasis on father figures and how one rebels against one's father. So Philby does have a quite interesting and complicated relationship with his very extraordinary and weird and flamboyant father, St. John Philby. So what happens is he sort of gets a little bit trapped in these two schematics and sees in Philby what he wants to see. Mm-hmm. But yeah, as you say, another terrible miscalculation he makes is that Philby is a terrible liar and he's not going to be very good at that. Philby's like the best liar. He's unbelievably good at lying and also at camouflage. So he's wonderfully good at making himself become the thing that people want to see. I read it in files all over the place, from US naval intelligence to Soviet reports to whatever. There's people going, God, Philby's marvellous. Isn't Philby marvellous? Right? What a guy. But, you know, he's obviously being a slightly different guy to each of these people. He meets Arnold Deutsch on a park bench in Regent's Park in 1934, and Deutsch recruits him, and Deutsch sees what he wants to see. But with this caveat that he thinks he's a terrible liar, yeah, and he's proved wrong. Philby will be, you know, one of the 20th century's greatest liars.
We all see what we want to see. And of course, there's so much appetite for stories about spying and stories about, you know, dashing young men with martini glasses. But we also know that a lot of these young men really saw themselves as glamorous figures, somewhat in the way that we do. I wonder, as you sort of delved into the stories of these five guys, what did you learn about who was motivated by ideology and who was motivated by a kind of cinematic self-image, and how did those factors intersect?
That is a great question. So we see them as glamorous, I think, and we look at photos of them and the existing videos of Philby, for example. And by the way, I should mention there are five of them. Ken Cross is always the outsider. He's always slightly different. So he's not that glamorous. He's not that good looking. He's
right.
Not that
ideological.
Thank
you for stipulating.
Okay, so you know, the other four, right? So they are, you know, good looking, charming, affable, guys who have lots of friends, who everybody likes. They have lots of lovers. They're very successful with women and men, for the ones who are interested in men. So there is definitely that element. It's part of what makes them so successful, and it's part of their continuing allure to us now. And you can't escape that. Even though I was writing a book that was kind of trying to stop glamorizing them, in a way you can never escape the fact that they are quite glamorous because they're swanning around, being charming, seducing people, drinking lots. It is a story of glamour. And now, in terms of their motivation, that's really interesting, the way you put it, that sort of cinematic self-image. I think there's definitely an element of that, particularly for Philby and Burgess, of like, this is the role that they're playing, the game that they're playing. Philby takes huge amounts of glee. I use the word glee very deliberately because you can read in his memoirs and in other bits and pieces of writing we have from him, this kind of total glee at being the spider in the middle of a web that other people don't even know exists, right? So at various points, he's fooling everybody, British intelligence, American intelligence, Soviet intelligence, his wife, his children. Nobody knows the truth except Kim Philby. And that's heady, powerful stuff, right? So I think absolutely that. I think the ideology is really strong. I think they are, particularly Donald MacLean, but all of them, massively committed to the ideology and its internal logic. I guess, though, there are lots of people who are committed to communism in the 1930s, but they don't go on to betray their country, right? You know, it's not enough. It has to be the marriage of a very persuasive and powerful ideology that really is. I mean, people do terrible things for ideology. I think those of us who are not ideological sometimes struggle to understand how powerful it can be. But it's the marriage of that incredibly powerful ideology with incredibly toxic, narcissistic, self-referential, as you said, character traits that gives them the ability to do what they do and fool everybody they love and betray everybody they love and betray everybody they are close to.
Right. Betray everyone they love, betray everyone they're close to, betray their country, but also wreak massive damage and violence. I mean, when you say the facts of what these men were doing sometimes got in the way of their ideology in an inconvenient sense, is it true that they had the comprehension of the scope of the potential damage that they were doing in such a way that it could actually get in the way? Or is it more the case that violence and bloody revolution were somehow so romantic to them that they could only bolster that fantasy?
I think they understood what they were doing, and they thought that revolutions were supposed to be bloody and revolutions were supposed to hurt people, because you can't have a bloodless revolution. And actually, you know, Philby explicitly talks about turning his back on democratic socialism because the democracy doesn't work, right? So once you've turned your back on democratic socialism, you're effectively signing up for non-democratic socialism, which is revolution, you know. And the circles they were in Cambridge, the leader of the young Cambridge intellectuals was a massive fan of Bela Kun, who ran the world's first communist state in Hungary in the early 1920s. And it turned into, there was terror. They were killing people left, right and centre. And it was precisely that attracted the young communists to it. They appreciated the revolutionary resolve, the hardness of character, the need for you to stand firm against kind of bourgeois squeamishness about death and blood. You've got to be strong for the cause, and the cause will involve blood. So I don't think they had any illusions about that. One of the kind of exculpatory narratives about these guys is that it wasn't possible to know in the 1930s, when they were all signed up, about the horrors of Stalinism. And I did a lot of work about what was public knowledge and what wasn't in the 1930s, and came to the conclusion that it was absolutely everywhere possible to know what Stalinism meant in the 30s. What happens is, during the war, we go through a process of deliberately forgetting the crimes of Stalinism because he's our friend. And then in the 50s, we rediscover them as if it's for the first time. But if you look at the newspapers and the books and, you know, the debates in Parliament, etc., in the 1930s, we knew about the famine, we knew about the terror, we knew about dekulakization, we knew about the horrible human cost of the rapid industrialization, we knew about slavery in the gulag. They knew all of this. They didn't care. This was the point. It was supposed to be difficult. I think where they were blind was to where the horrors don't match their radiant vision, right? So they expect horrors, but they don't let any of those horrors ever make them question the vision, the endpoint, the theory. And I find that difficult.
Absolutely difficult, yes. I want to ask you more about your perspective here. I mean, I know that you wrote a novel about Poland that struggled to find a home. And I wonder if you could talk about that experience and sort of what you came to learn about what we might call Anglo-centric histories and storytelling more broadly in the process.
The genesis of it all, actually, was I read an absolutely brilliant book called The Devil's Alliance. It's about the Nazi-Soviet pact by a guy called Roger Morehouse, who I now actually podcast with. But I read it before we were kind of friends, and it revolutionized the way I thought about everything. I'd swallowed the line that Stalin gave out that the Nazi-Soviet pact was just a kind of cunning way to buy time before he took on Hitler. And I'd also bought into the mythology that we won the war. We didn't really win the war. Stalin won the war. Your perspective on the Second World War totally and utterly changes depending on where you stand in Europe or, elsewhere, actually. If you're Lithuanian or Polish, who won the war? It wasn't the Americans, it was Stalin. And then in the course of reading Devil's Alliance, which I heartily recommend to all your listeners, I learned really for the first time about the scale of Stalin's deportations in Poland and the Baltic states, not just after the war, you see, before the war. In August 1939, our phony war was when Stalin was using the terms of the secret protocol of the Nazi-Soviet pact to take over half of Poland and all of the Baltic states and transport millions of women and children to Siberia. And this is an untold story in the English narrative. We don't really think about it very much. We don't really tell it. So yeah, I did. I wrote a novel about a family who were deported to Siberia from Poland during the war. And sadly, I couldn't find a home. And actually one of the potential publishers was like, yeah, we like the book, but it's a bit too Polish. I was like, well, And actually, so there's a lot of Poland in this book that I've written. And because the 5 are helpful to Stalin in his obvious project of seizing and holding Poland, with unbelievable irony, telling a story in which I am trying to escape Anglocentrism. I'm telling a very Anglo-centric story in order to tell the story of Poland and the Baltic states through the back door. And I appreciate all the ironies of that position. But, publishing is what it is. And, people are what they are. And I think sometimes it's easier to tell a story which is attached to a story that people know well than try and tell totally new stories.
You also drew heavily from sources in Albania and Lithuania. Can you talk about that process and maybe also about how these men are understood in those places?
Because I wanted it to not be an Anglo-centric story, I went elsewhere for information. And one of Kim Philby's great coups for the Soviets is that from 1944, he is the head of anti-Soviet counterintelligence for the British Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6. He then does another job and then he ends up in Washington. But for that whole period, broadly, he is all over all the operations which are sending displaced men, largely, across the Iron Curtain into the Baltic states, into Albania, into Poland. And he is integral in portraying all of these operations, which are also compromised by really good Soviet counterintelligence on the ground. So he's not the only piece in the chess set, but he's a really important one. So it was important to me to try and do what I could to look at other archives as well to see if I could see the other side of the story. So I got access to the Lithuanian KGB archives, which was incredibly useful. And then I used the Albanian archives because Kim Philby was specifically from 1949 to 1951 the liaison between British and American intelligence services in their missions to infiltrate Albania, which was initially supposed to be a kind of regime change mission. So the Sigurimi, the Albanian secret police files, only opened a few years ago. You had to jump some hoops to get into them, but I had a wonderful Albanian research assistant called Enksi Becker who helped me get into them and then helped me trawl them because obviously they're in Albanian. And it was brilliant. Like, we found amazing stuff. Oh, we didn't find, a piece of paper saying Kim Philby told us that this parachute was coming. It doesn't work like that. But we found enough to piece together a really interesting alternative side of a story that we knew bits and pieces about. In terms of how they're viewed in those countries, Philby, it is known that he was involved. There has been a trend to downplay his role and talk more about how good Soviet counterintelligence was. But I argue in the book that both work together very helpfully. There's a very, very, very interesting Kim Philby fan club developing in Moscow, though. Chief cheerleader, one Vladimir Putin. Part of his myth-making around the Ukraine war being like an anti-fascist crusade, he's kind of pushing the idea that Philby was like an anti-fascist warrior who understood that the Russians were leading this fight. So in recent years, there's been a Moscow Square renamed after Kim Philby. There's been a statue put up of Kim Philby near a crucial battlefield that Kim Philby gave them information about during the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as they call them. It's an example, I guess, of the kind of weaponization of history and memory.
I suppose it's a complicated and perhaps impossible, maybe annoying question, but is it possible to put in contemporary terms the scope of the magnitude of their intelligence?
Yeah, in contemporary terms, it's actually really difficult, because in contemporary terms, nothing is really about human intelligence in the same way. It's like the things that matter most in intelligence now tend to be electronic and whatever. And the sheer volume of data that zooms about the world now to be processed by intelligence services, it's just so different that putting it in contemporary terms, I'm not sure works very well. And also because it was so uncontemporary how they were getting this information. So, for example, Don McLean's at the Foreign Office during the war. He'll just take a top secret file and just say to the secretary, "Oh, Gladys, whatever, I'm going to work on this overnight." And he just walks out the building. Nobody checks, nobody cares, nobody asks challenges. Walks out of the building, top secret file, takes it to his safe flat where his Russian handler is waiting for him. They photograph it. The next morning he takes it back in. I mean, it really is that simple. We're not talking about having to do elaborate things, right? They are walking out of the buildings with briefcases full of top secret documents. When John Cairncross is at Bletchley Park briefly during the war, every day from Bletchley Park, this kind of box is ferried to Downing Street with great ceremony, and inside it are the secrets of the day. And there's a key at Bletchley Park, and only Churchill has a key in London, and it's sort of ceremonially delivered to him, and he opens it up, whatever. Meanwhile, John Cairncross is working as a translator in one of the huts. He's just literally picking the stuff up off the floor, stuffing it down his trousers, and walking out of Bletchley Park. And then he gets on a train, meets his handler, winks at him, and then they get off and they exchange the papers. I mean, so in terms of putting it into a contemporary context, it kind of almost doesn't make sense. Yeah. Guy Burgess is a terrible drunk. He quite often has his meetings in pubs, and there's one brilliant account by one of his handlers where they do the handover of these priceless documents. I mean, at various times, Guy Burgess has access to cabinet minutes. I mean, unbelievable top secret stuff. He spills it all on the floor of the men's toilets in the pub, and this poor Russian handler is like peeling it off the floor and like trying to walk off with it. So yeah, it's very, very old school. There is not much in the way of contemporary resonance. The other half of your question, I guess, is the scale of it. And we are talking tens of thousands of documents. And the Cambridge Five are differently important at different stages. But at various points, it's cabinet minutes, it's defence capacities of the entire empire, it's the first inklings of a British nuclear weapons programme, later on the American atomic weapons programme. It's a complete rundown of MI5, which is the British Domestic Intelligence Agency, and how it operates and who works for it. Ditto, exactly the same for MI6. Here's an example, which is one of the mind-blowing ones. I'm going to give you two mind-blowing examples of the kind of like, okay, so number one, in the war, Winston Churchill realises he doesn't know what's going on at MI5, right? So Guy Liddell, who's the deputy director of MI5, Britain's Domestic Intelligence Unit, decides he's going to give Winston Churchill a fortnightly briefing on everything that MI5 is doing during the war. And the man who chooses to write that briefing is top Soviet spy Anthony Blunt. So everything that Churchill knows about MI5, Stalin knows about MI5 during the war. Yeah. So, mind-blowing. Okay, mind-blowing fact number two. At the end of the war, just when the Grand Alliance is breaking down, right, when the Red Army boots are like taking over Europe, the only thing that Churchill and Roosevelt have got to try and protect the people of Poland and Eastern Europe and Central Europe from Stalinist control is diplomatic kind of wrangling and manoeuvring. And at that precise juncture in history, Stalin is reading the personal correspondence between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, thanks to Donald Maclean at the Soviet embassy.
Yeah,
it's extraordinary. I could do one more. Can I do one more?
Please.
Okay. The birth of NATO. We can watch through Putinism how unbelievably sensitive the Russians are to NATO. So the opening conversations about the possibility that NATO might exist are so secret that they're taking place in a steel-lined room in the basement of the Pentagon. No notes are allowed to be taken. The French aren't allowed to attend because they think the French are a bit leaky. So it's just the British and the Americans, no notes, just thrashing it out. What's this going to look like? What is NATO going to look like? And they're not even communicating with their people back home. Okay, this is a closed room. In the room is top Soviet spy Donald Maclean. And he was giving it all to the Soviets. So the Soviets knew more about the planning for NATO than the British Foreign Office.
So, Antonia, one hears about authors writing books of history and sort of, falling in love with their subjects, or at least developing sympathies for them. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you had neither of those experiences.
So, yeah, Morgan, I started writing this book kind of mildly disliking them, and I ended up totally despising them. I couldn't hate them more. So partly for all the reasons we've talked about, they were treacherous, they betrayed their country, and they betrayed their country at a moment of great existential peril for Britain. From 1939 to 1941, they had to work very hard to get their information to the Soviets because all their handlers had been swallowed up by the terror. But they did. They managed to get information through at a time when Stalin and Hitler were essentially allies and Britain was backs against the wall on its own, and these guys were giving our secrets to Stalin. Unthinkable. And then again, what Philby does after the war, others are involved in as well, betraying those individual men who are so bravely setting off in parachutes and boats and walking across the Iron Curtain straight into the arms of the KGB. Well, it's the NKVD, MGB at that stage. It changed its name all the time. It's so they didn't think about the horrors for later historians when they kept changing their names. So yeah, it's horrific. I hate them. Then the other thing that I picked up on, and I wonder whether I picked up on this because I'm a woman writing this history. So a lot of attention has been paid to the sort of sex life of the homosexual members of the Cambridge 5 spy ring. And I think because that fitted a certain narrative in the 60s that like this was a crime that was committed because these guys were homosexuals, and what more could you expect from homosexuals in a terrible moment of homophobia. And now that's gone, thankfully. I think we can see more clearly, and if you look at the heterosexual members of the Cambridge 5, how absolutely appallingly horrible they were to their wives, which I think is a measure of a man, right? So Donald Maclean, he's like 6'4". He's a really, really big guy. His wife is a tiny, petite American woman. One night they're on this boat going down the Nile, and he starts in front of all his colleagues. He's drunk. He's always drunk at this stage. Terrible alcoholic, angry, horrible alcoholic. He starts strangling his wife in front of all his colleagues. And one of his colleagues has to pull Donald Maclean off her. And he lands on top of his colleague. And he's such a big guy, he breaks this guy's leg. Okay, so this is the kind of man we're talking about. And he's beating her at home as well. And if he's doing this to her in front of people that he works with, what is he doing to her when nobody's watching, right? And then Kim Philby, in the 1950s, he's being watched by British intelligence. They know he's a spy, but they can't prove it. And they talk about him treating his wife, Eileen, with appalling brutality. These are, MI5 men of the 1950s. It must have been pretty bad for them to say that. And then when Eileen commits suicide in the late 1950s, I found in the files a note from her psychiatrist who knew all the secrets of the Philby marriage. And her psychiatrist said the minute he heard that Eileen Philby had committed suicide, he got in touch with her GP and said, check that body for puncture wounds. I am completely convinced that Kim Philby has either murdered her or had her murdered. So these are the men we're talking about. They're not glamorous, sexy rogues. They're wife-beating alcoholics who were capable of murdering their wives and, betrayed their country in the most hideous way. So yeah, Morgan, I'm afraid, no sympathy.
I do want to mention, you have a podcast about history books now. What are your criteria for what makes a good history book?
There are two types of history books. right? Those that seek to tell stories in the most effective and gripping way, which also have strong analytical oomph too. And sort of academic books that are much more analytical in their approach and tend to not be chronological and tend not to be narrative. And I think there's a place for both. And I wouldn't want at all for academic historians to start trying to zhuzh everything up, because I think we need them to do their thing, which is to be forensic and sharp and analytical about everything they touch. But I think there is also room for story. And I think story is really important. I think it's what brings people to the table in the first place. I think it's what grips people. It's what keeps them there. You can talk about the ideas too. It's just, if you get the narrative as well, then you're cooking with diesel, as people say.
Yeah. And do you have another one up your sleeve?
Yeah, I'm working on something at the moment, but it's too soon, I'm afraid.
It's a total blast talking to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to The Debrief. We hope you enjoyed this latest chat between True Spies producer Morgan Childs and Antonia Senior. If you liked what you heard, more debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
I'll be honest. Shopping for clothes is not my favorite thing. I just want to look good without overthinking it. Stitch Fix makes it easy. You take a quick style quiz, your size, your vibe, your budget, and a real human stylist sends a box with clothes that actually fit your life. Try it on at home, keep what works, send back the rest. Shipping's free, no subscription required. Get $20 off at stitchfix.com/Spotify. That's stitchfix.com/Spotify.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.